We'll now show the action of the major muscles of yoga, here with a model who's ready to demonstrate all of these yoga postures. We'll begin with the pectoralis major. Recall this muscle internally rotates the arms, it also adducts the arms, and it brings the arms forward in flexion. I'll go ahead and have my model start in upward plank, and then notice the shoulder movement as he moves from upward plank into chaturanga, the yoga push-up. So the arms come in, the arms internally rotate, and it's really shortening and contracting the pec major. And then in dhanurasana, the floor bow, this is where we see a lengthening of the pec major. So as my model brings his arm behind him and then kicks his feet up, there's a lengthening as the pec major goes into this type of eccentric contraction. The next muscle here is pec minor, and this posture really helps. And because pec minor stabilizes, depresses, and protracts the scapula, this is really apparent in talasana or uplutihi. So here my model will go ahead and push up into talasana and really notice the action of the shoulder. This is the pec minor contracting as it's helping to protract and then depress the scapula. So it's really helping to stabilize the scapula up against his body. And then just like pec major, pec minor also has this lengthening as it contracts in floor bow. So again, as my model kicks up into floor bow, really notice the chest area, and it's this pectoralis minor, this deep muscle underneath pec major, which is getting a nice lengthening as it contracts during this posture. The serratus anterior is the muscle which pulls the scapula around the body. Remember, this is the boxer's muscle. So here as my model is in utkatasana, the awkward or the chair pose, the action of the scapula with the serratus anterior is being pulled forward and around the thorax. Here as my model moves into the camel pose, ustrasana, we can really see that the serratus anterior is lengthening because now the scapula is doing the opposite direction. It's moving backwards and more posterior medially around the thorax. We can take a look at the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii here together as my model moves from high plank to chaturanga. So in high plank, the bicep is lengthened and the tricep is contracted. And now the opposite will happen as he moves down into chaturanga, the yoga push-up. The biceps is shortening as it's contracting and the triceps is lengthening. And then as he pushes back up, we see the opposite thing happen. So we really see this agonist-antagonist relationship between the biceps and the triceps here, as well as how the muscle contractions happen during this posture. We can really see that the body calls upon the rotator cuff muscles anytime significant range of motion of the shoulders is required in yoga. A really nice posture which demonstrates this is gomukhasana, or the cow face posture. And here my model has moved into gomukhasana, and we see that the left shoulder is internally rotated while the right shoulder is externally rotated. Both of these actions require the contraction, lengthening, and stability which is provided by the rotator cuff muscles. Arm balances, anytime you stand on your hands in yoga, such as a handstand, or what my model is going to demonstrate here, a crow pose, really shows off the rotator cuffs in their external rotated position as well as their stability position. So here as my model moves into crow, really take a look at what his shoulders are doing. It's this nice external rotation, but the scapula is also really stable up against the body, and it's the rotator cuff which is providing this stability of the shoulder. We can take a look at the action of the trapezius muscle here in a couple of yoga postures that really help to move around the scapula. So as I cue my model here into chair pose or utkatasana, really pay attention to what his shoulders are doing, and then notice what the trapezius action is here. So as you go ahead and move into chair pose, utkatasana, you can really see that the shoulder blades are rotating and lifting, and that is the action of the middle and the upper trapezius. And then now really pay attention to my model's shoulders and the trapezius area, the upper diamond-shaped muscle on his back, as he gets into Gadasana, eagle pose. So go ahead and get into eagle pose and really notice the lengthening that has to happen along the upper back. And this is lengthening of all three portions of the trapezius in order to allow the crossing motion of the arm. And here's another angle of the same posture, Gadasana, eagle pose. And we can see here from the side, again, we're paying attention to this trapezius muscle. And as my model here moves into eagle pose, really notice the lengthening that has to happen in order to allow both of his arms to come in front of his face. And that is lengthening in all three parts of the trapezius. We'll now talk here about the latissimus dorsi. Recall that's the swimmer's muscle, so it's really responsible for this internal rotation of the shoulder. And here as my model moves into, again, gomukhasana, a crow pose, really notice this internal rotation of his shoulder that has to happen, stabilizing the entire pelvic girdle, but also engaging, shortening, and contracting the latissimus dorsi to allow for the balance of the upper body. And here we see the opposite action in the latissimus dorsi. My model is in child's pose. I finally decided to give him a break for a posture here. So he's in this nice, relaxed child's pose. His arms are in front of him, hips are sinking back, and the latissimus is in this nice, lengthened position, but it's still contracting. Remember, it's this eccentric type of contraction that we're viewing here. And now we see here the action of the rhomboids. The rhomboids are in charge of depressing the scapula. And there's also a little bit of a protraction here that happens as well. And we can see the action here as my model moves into shalabhasana, locust pose. So notice his middle back here, the shortening and the contraction. And notice his shoulder blades came back. And that's the action here of the shortening contraction of the rhomboids muscle. And now we have the opposite action when we have an eagle pose or a gomukhasana. So notice my model's middle back here as he moves his arms into this eagle pose. That's lengthening of the rhomboids muscles. And that allows for movement forward of the scapula. We'll now look at the action of the Erector spina group. Recall the Erector spina, they're here basically to hold our spines upright. And so really notice my model's entire length of his back as he enters dhanurasana, the bow pose. So we can see the entire contraction along all parts of his spine, which allows for this basically backward bending motion or spinal extension, because the Erector spina group are shortening and contracting in order to make this motion possible. And here we have the opposite motion. So notice the Erector spina group here as my model moves into paschimottanasana or forward fold. So there's lengthening of the Erector spina group, which allows for this really deep forward fold. And again, the Erector spina are an eccentric contraction. If they were just switched off or turned off, basically my model would fall straight forward and there wouldn't be any sort of nice dynamic contraction here happening. We'll now look at the muscles of the abdominals. Everyone loves boat pose. So, when it comes out time in class when your teacher's like, let's start Navasana, pretty much all of your muscles of your abdomen are really contracting and firing during this posture. But we'll talk here about the rectus abdominis. So notice the central muscle of my model as he moves into Navasana boat pose. And this muscle is shortening as it contracts. And it's moving into concentric contraction here in order to move his spine into this spinal flexion position. And then the opposite action here, my model here is going to go ahead and move into floor bow, dhanurasana. And this is really going to lengthen the rectus abdominis as it contracts. And again, this rectus abdominis is not just switched off in this posture. That would be not very comfortable for the model. It also would not be really possible to get this nice shape, this bow shape pose. So the rectus abdominis is an eccentric contraction during this really deep backward bend. We can talk now about the obliques, both the external and the internal obliques. Again, when both sides fire, the left and the right, of both the external and internal obliques, we get this flexion motion, which is again our favorite posture, Navasana. So pay attention to that oblique area here as my model moves into Navasana. So notice the contraction along the sides of his abdominals, both sides, left and right, internal and external, are in this concentric contraction in order to make this posture happen. And we can also take a look here at a posture, Marichyasana C. It's this really deep twist that comes from the Ashtanga Yoga series. And in this twist, we can really have a nice look at what the internal and the external obliques are doing. So here my model is going to twist to his right side. And the external obliques allow rotation to the opposite side. So it's the left external oblique, which is shortening and contracting, allowing him to turn to the right. It is his right external oblique, which is lengthening here to allow for the motion. Now the internal obliques are doing the opposite action here. Remember this, they're on this parallel array where they're set up basically opposite from one another. So the internal oblique on his right side is shortening as it contracts, allowing him to turn to the right, while the left side of his internal oblique is lengthening. So we have both of these actions happening at the same time in the abdomen in basically a perpendicular fashion. We'll now take a look at the transverse abdominis, this muscle which transverses the entire abdomen in a horizontal fashion. And again, I'll cue my model here to get into Navasana, and we really notice how the transverse abdominis is contracting here. So the transverse abdominis's job is to compress and stabilize the core. So it is a really deep muscle, and we've talked about all of these other abdominal muscles, which are basically on top of the transverse abdominis. But if the transverse abdominis wasn't there to provide this stability to the core, this Navasana basically wouldn't look the same. So it's this deep muscle which is allowing my model to really contract and compress the core as he's moved into this position. And here we can see the opposite action. So my model here is going to demonstrate Padikasana, or gate pose. And so as he reaches over into the posture, the side that he's reaching over towards, his left side, the transverse abdominis is contracting and shortening. But the right side, the transverse abdominis there, that's lengthening. So we're getting both of those actions here in this type of posture. We'll now look at the gluteal group, and we'll start with the gluteus medius. And here my model is going to move into Shalabhasana. So it is the gluteus medius, this outer, larger gluteal muscle, which is going to contract as he does these back bends, because this posture really is a great deal of leg strength. So it's this contraction of the gluteal group, the shortening of it, which is going to allow for the backward bending position here. And here in the opposite action of the gluteus maximus, we have paschimottanasana, the forward fold. So in this posture, the gluteus maximus lengthens as it contracts in order to allow for this forward fold. Now we can talk about the stabilizing group of the glute group. So the gluteus medius and minimus. These are your stabilizers, especially as any posture that requires you to balance on one leg. And this also happens every day in life when you take a step or you walk upstairs. In yoga, we can see here a tree pose. So my model is going to move into tree pose. And the glute group on the standing balancing leg, that is going to be shortening as it contracts in order to provide the stability required to balance on one leg. And now we can see the opposite action of the gluteus medius and minimus. Here my model is going to move into, again, eagle pose, Gadasana. But here the action is in the lower body. So really pay attention to the hip and the gluteal region. So there's balance on one leg, but also the other leg has to cross over and make the twist on the standing balancing leg. So the glute medius and minimus, both of those muscles are lengthening as they contract, and they provide not only the stretch that has to happen here for the legs to make contact, but also the balance and stability required by the entire lower body that's required to stand on one leg. We can now talk about the iliopsoas, the psoas, the key hip flexor of the lower body. And so I'm going to cue my model here to move into Virabhadrasana, or warrior two pose. And we'll see that on the bent leg, his standing bent knee, the psoas on the left side is shortening as it contracts because it's putting that part of the leg into hip flexion. But the other leg is not in hip flexion, we're actually in hip extension. So in that leg, the psoas is lengthening as it contracts to allow for the hip extension. So we see both aspects of the psoas in this one posture. We can now talk about the hamstring groups here. Those three muscles on the back of the leg, they all contract together. So as my model moves here into upward plank, Purvottanasana, it is the back of the upper leg which you're paying attention to. And the back of the upper leg, all the hamstring group here is contracting and shortening during the contraction in order to allow for the body to move upwards into this upward plank motion. And then now my model is going to move into Paschimottanasana, the seated forward fold. And in this exercise, the hamstring group is lengthening as they contract. This is because the hip is flexed and the knee is extended. So it allows for all of the hamstring group to really lengthen during the contraction. And this is what allows for the straight leg portion of this straight-legged forward fold. Taking a look at the quadriceps muscles here, we can really see shortening and contraction of the quadriceps anytime the leg is brought into flexion. So here my model is going to enter utkatasana, and notice the anterior portion of the upper leg, here the quadriceps groups. This entire portion of the upper leg is shortening during the contraction, and this is what allows you to bring the leg up towards you during this posture. And here we see the opposite of this, lengthening of the quadricep group in a posture like Supta Virasana, reclining hero pose. As my model works his way into this posture, really notice this anterior compartment of the upper leg. All of the quadricep muscles have to lengthen as they contract in order for my model to be able to bring his upper body down to the floor. We can talk about actions of the gastrocnemius and the soleus together, since they're both working to plantar flex the foot. And the example posture here is this upward plank, the purvottanasana. So as my model makes his way into the upward plank, really notice the extreme plantar flexion of the foot that is required by the gastroc and the soleus, which are shortening as they contract. And it's because they contract in this way, the foot plantar flex, and the hips are allowed to raise into this upward plank position. The opposite here we can see in downward facing dog. Both soleus and gastrocnemius lengthen as they contract in this posture. This is because the foot is in dorsiflexion, so it's the opposite of that plantar flexion motion we just saw. And in order to bring the heels down close to the ground, the gastroc and the soleus must lengthen in order to provide this movement. And here we can see the action of the tibialis anterior. My model will move into utkatasana, and the tibialis anterior will shorten during this contraction here. This will put the foot into dorsiflexion, and it will really also help to keep the foot in this position during the posture. So it's this really strong muscle which controls the dorsiflexion of the foot. So the tibialis anterior shortens to provide the motion that this posture requires. In opposition, we can see lengthening of the tibialis anterior in postures like Supta Virasana. So here my model is going to move into Supta Virasana. The reclining hero pose requires lengthening of this anterior compartment of the leg, and especially the anterior tibialis muscle. If this muscle was not able to lengthen properly, then there wouldn't be appropriate plantar flexion of the foot, and there wouldn't be appropriate flexion of the knee. And both of those are required in this posture.